Welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. My name is Ben Eriksen, and I am the managing editor of this podcast. And I've come from behind the curtains in some ways to interview a very special guest, Dr. Peter Kreeft. Thanks for joining us today, Doctor. How are you doing?
Okay, I hope. God only knows.
Indeed. Well, I'm sure many of our listeners are familiar with you and your work, but for those who are not, I want to give a brief introduction. You're a graduate of Fordham University, and you completed your doctoral dissertation under Father Norris Clark. I've read some of his works, which are also excellent. And you began teaching at Boston College, and you're still teaching there to this day. Is that correct?
That's right.
This is your 60th year of teaching. What a blessing for all your students to be teaching that long. So thank you for that. You've written also well over 100 books, at least 20 or more I was looking through are published by Ignatius, and we're very grateful for that. But today we're focusing in on some of your works on Aquinas, because when this podcast is released, it's going to be the day before Aquinas' feast day and also the 800th anniversary of his birth. So there's, some solemnity to this podcast. And so what, better way could we do than speaking with you about Aquinas? And particularly, we're going to talk about three books. The first is the Summa of the Summa, which is your collection of texts from the Summa Theologiae. And for me, this book has a particular dearness to my heart because, I work for Ignatius, but I'm also a graduate student at the Catholic University of America. And this book was actually pivotal in me becoming a philosopher and studying philosophy. It was, I would say, like the Nicomachean Ethics and then this book. So that was a very excellent book. I still look back at you. If you look through my copy, it's got all these notes in it and stuff like that. Then we're also looking at the shorter summas. There's a condensing of the Summa Theologiae even more. And then the last one is practical theology, in which you kind of shift from a philosophical discussion to more of a theological. And all these are really kind of a condensed version of Aquinas that makes Aquinas approachable for everyday Catholics and people who want to read Aquinas. So now there's
I want a slight correction to one of the things you said. It's not a different version of Aquinas. It's a selection of his texts with explanatory footnotes.
Yeah.
So it's Aquinas himself.
For me, I think that's one of the most refreshing aspects of it. One of the things that you say in your introductions is you mentioned that it's sometimes the Thomists are more confusing than Aquinas. And I don't know if you want to expound on that.
In fact, in a sense, no one is less confusing than Aquinas. It's startlingly clear and logical, and beginners, once they master the terminology, have smooth sailing through Aquinas, much more so than almost any other philosopher. Aristotle probably takes second place in common sense.
Indeed. And we'll talk a little bit more about that common sense. But when I was kind of reflecting on this episode that I'm going to do with you, one of the questions I've always wanted to ask you is what was your first experience reading Aquinas? Like I talked about, my first experience actually is reading the Summa of the Summa. And what was your first experience actually reading Aquinas? Do you remember that?
I don't. I remember my first experience reading C.S. Lewis.
Okay.
It was an assignment to outline the abolition of man. And this was a difficult book. Lewis is usually simpler than that. And I was amazed to find that obviously that book is very clear and brilliant in the author's mind. Obviously, it was not so clear and brilliant in my mind. And what was most obvious to me was that it was totally I who was at fault, not Lewis. I recognized its logic without understanding it. Second reading was eye-opening. Third reading is even more eye-opening. Well, that's how I find Aquinas too. Some philosophers, the more you read them, the more complicated they get. Aquinas is exactly the opposite. Every reading becomes clearer and simpler. It's almost guaranteed.
Yeah, I would agree. You actually mentioned, you quote your director, Father Norris Clark, in saying there's three types of philosophers. Those that are start obscure and get clear, those that are clear and then become obscure, and then those who just simply remain obscure. I don't know if you could expand on that and maybe even put a couple philosophers in each one of those, rankings.
Well, Hegel and Heidegger are the two examples usually given. And in fact, both of those philosophers are very profound, but not terribly clear. Most analytic philosophers are very clear and not terribly profound. I find deconstructionists neither profound nor clear. In fact, they're almost astonishingly unclear. I couldn't possibly invent a more confusing philosophy than deconstructionism. If uh, if the Godfather and a deconstructionist married, their children would grow up to make their parents an offer they couldn't understand.
I love it. I love it. So you would put Hegel in the obscure and remains obscure. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
I would agree with that. When I was studying for some of my tests, Hegel was always the one I was least excited to read because I never felt like I really could get beyond just a
Yes.
summary understanding of his thought. But Aquinas seems to be one that there's a lot of trepidation about initially reading him, but he does become clearer with time, and that's why I think your works are so helpful because they make that clarity much more accessible. So in choosing to write these books, how did you kind of pick some of the selections to figure out, like, okay, this is one that I wanted to do?
I'm kind of lazy, and I'm always tempted to take the easy way out. Sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. And I did that with Aquinas. I never read all of Aquinas. I read the usual passages until I had to do what I planned in the practical theology, namely, deal not just with Aquinas's properly philosophical passages, but even with the theological passages. And the Summa Theologiae is basically theology, philosophy as an aid to theology. Mm-hmm. So in order to prepare for that book, I had to read all 4,000 pages of Summa Theologica for the first time in my life. And that was a wonderful experience.
That's great.
That was rewarding, and it vastly increased my not only understanding but appreciation of Aquinas. You don't need to do that yourself. I have gathered, I think, typical examples of Aquinas' brilliance and relevance and common sense together. So both of those books are selling quite well. I was amazed at how well the Summa sold, because Aquinas has a reputation of being very difficult. And I keep getting letters and emails from people who say, I picked it up and I didn't think I could understand it, but I did. Never took a philosophy course. I understand the thing. The footnotes make it clear.
Yes. Well, I think that's one of the best resources in the Summa that, I read this in high school. And, when you think, a high school text, I would say that the Summa Theologiae is not one that people would normally think of. But really, the combination between the footnotes and then the glossary, because sometimes there's just like, you don't know what this term means. And just to have a nice, easy definition to just quickly explain it is very helpful for people getting into Aquinas.
I remember I climbed a mountain near my home in New Jersey. It was only a few thousand feet high. And I took the hard way. I didn't know there was a path up the mountain. So it took me, maybe 3 hours to get to the top. And then years later, when I returned with my fiancée, whom I married, I persuaded her to go with me. And she said, why not use the road? I said, what road? She said, that's a road not to go up the mountain. And we got up in 30 minutes. Well, those two mountain climbing expeditions are kind of analogous to, number one, reading Aquinas without reading the glossary first and using modern terminology, and then you're in the thicket. Yeah. Or understanding that Aquinas uses maybe his 12 most basic terms in a significantly different way than we do in modern English. And once you get through that barrier, once you find the road, it's really smooth going.
It really is. It really is. And each one of your works, you talked about practical theology, which is, as the name suggests, a theological text. The Summa of the Summa and then a shorter Summa are more philosophical works, correct? I mean, you kind of distinguish the two. But what I found interesting is in your introduction to the Summa of the Summa, you make the claim that Aquinas, at least in your eyes, is the greatest philosopher to ever live. And that statement could be controversial for some. One, saying he's the greatest, right? There's certain other contenders. But I would like to, before we go to that, I would like to focus on the fact that you say he's a philosopher. A lot of people I think would say he's a theologian. So could you distinguish or at least clarify, like, in what ways Aquinas a philosopher and in what ways a theologian? Can you be one without the other?
You can't be a good theologian without being a good philosopher. although you can be a good philosopher without being a good theologian, because philosophy is to theology what math is to physics. It's the language that theologians use.
I love that.
So it was a relatively easy task for me to go through the Summa and extract the philosophical passages, and among them the most important ones, and then to clarify them with footnotes and the glossary. The reason he is, in my mind, the greatest philosopher as well as the greatest theologian is that philosophy is the search for wisdom, which is not just factual information, it's understanding. The word reason is a good example of a word that he uses in a different way than we do. When we say reason, we almost always mean argument. But reason for Aquinas is all that distinguishes man from the beasts, including intuition, including moral conscience, including the power to do art. Everything that has a rational component. We think of reason as something computers do. That's only a small part of what reason is, according to Aquinas.
It's a much larger enterprise that he's undertaking, but it's also built on the greats in his past. Like, when I think of like the greatest philosopher, I have a particular love for Aristotle, which I'm certainly would.
So do I. So do I. And Aquinas called him simply the philosopher,
which is great. I love that. When people, because I love Plato too, but as Aristotle says, we love the truth more. And so when people compare the two, I always make that joke that, well, Aquinas called him the philosopher, so there's something there. But in one way, I think that's something often overlooked is how much he is really resting on the shoulders of those before him. Obviously, his teachers of his own era, but also Aristotle and Plato. Can you talk a little bit about those influences in his philosophy specifically?
Well, Aristotle is basically Plato modified. At least 3/4 of Aristotle is Plato. And almost every medieval, including Aquinas, had as his ambition to somehow combine Plato and Aristotle, surely the two greatest philosophers of ancient times.
Mm-hmm.
The difference between Plato and his enemies, the Sophists, is enormous. The difference between Plato and Aristotle is trivial. Are the forms independent entities, or are they simply the forms of concrete things, thus abstracted into concepts by the mind? Add Augustine to Aristotle, and you get Aquinas. Augustine's a Platonist, didn't know Aristotle that well. And he said there's one thing missing in Aristotle's metaphysics. These forms obviously have to be in the mind of God before they can be either in our mind or in things. So Aquinas combines the two by saying that the Platonic ideas or forms or essences or natures or answers to the question, what is it, are in three places. First of all, in the mind of God. Secondly, in things as designed by God. And thirdly, in our mind as abstracted from those things. That's a typical example of Aquinas combining Plato and Aristotle and Augustine.
It's amazing to me when I read the Summa and I read Aquinas' work, how he's able to weave all of these philosophers together into one coherent work. And you mentioned this is when you say he's the greatest philosopher ever, you give 8 different reasons, and we can't go through all of them, but one of them you say he's kind of like a great example of what the medieval project was. And you point out that Aquinas is not the only one to have written a Summa. So can you expound on that a little bit? Because I don't think that's something a lot of people are familiar with, namely what was the medieval project and how the Summa is kind of, one of, Aquinas' Summa is one of many for the other scholastics.
Every great philosopher is a traditionalist. He learns from the past. And Aquinas is the great traditionalist, the great synthesizer. You find in him Heraclitus and Parmenides, already synthesized by Plato. You find Plato and Aristotle. You find Plotinus. You find Augustine. You find the Church Fathers. He's a great synthesizer. All the strands come together in a kind of a tapestry, and it's pretty complete. Not that it can't be added to. It's not a final system, but it's a magnificent system. And then after Aquinas, it begins to fall apart and fray. And for the last 800 years, philosophers have been arguing against each other rather than with each other. The very idea of philosophy as a community activity, not just an individual lonely activity, is a typically medieval idea, not a typically modern idea. So that's another way Aquinas is the greatest philosopher. He's got all of wisdom tied into one great big package.
I'm sorry. I'm very I'm intrigued by your one time about philosophy being a communal activity, because I think that's something, as studying philosophy myself, that is often the temptation is that we all go into our little corners in the library and we read books and we write them. And you are actually saying that that's not how philosophy should be done.
The first philosopher to deliberately do that was Descartes. And he didn't really do it because you find all sorts of previous philosophers in Descartes, including the scholastics and his enemies. And even his most famous argument, I think, therefore I am, is plagiarized from Augustine.
Yes.
Augustine wrote 2 books about that problem, the problem of skepticism. They were basically what Descartes simplified. But beginning with Descartes, you have that idea of the lonely philosopher doing it all over again, like Adam and Eve. But for Aquinas, there are other minds than his, and he's not all alone, himself plus God. That's a kind of Protestant idea, where you get saved as an individual and then you construct a Noah's Ark. The classic notion is God makes the ark and you join it. So Aquinas comes on the scene and there really is a very large ark, and he goes into it and masters every part of it and then adds some things to it. By communal activity, I mean a community of the past as well as the present, not just a committee that says who are the greatest philosophers today, but a historian who has learned from thousands of years of magnificently wise minds. It's a kind of a stew.
I like that. And it's something that when I think of my own studies, like I think better when I'm talking it through with somebody. Like there are times where sometimes it's good to focus and to sit down with the greats of the past and read them and communion with them. But then it's also good to sit down with your own colleagues and your own friends to talk about it. Like even those who aren't philosophers, like I have a friend who's a state trooper, and some of my whole master's thesis came from a discussion with him, who's not even, a practicing philosopher, and I think that is something that's often missed with philosophy.
Well, the article in the Summa is basically a systematized Socratic dialogue. Aquinas always is philosophizing with his opponents in mind.
Yes.
He gives them the first voice, the objections. Then he states his position, then he answers each objection, distinguishing what's true in it and what's false in it. So Aquinas is really a very Socratic philosopher. He philosophizes in dialogue. And of course, that's not only more dramatic and more exciting, but more productive than philosophizing in monologue. Just as having 2 eyes is more productive than having one, even though you see the same world, 2 eyes gives you a sense of perspective, as if you're 2 people at once.
Yeah.
And it's also more true to reality because reality is defined by God, its creator. God is not alone. He's a trinity. He's a community. He's a society, as well as a one.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that's a problem, hopefully, that can be resolved in part with your book, and also just part of people talking about this with other people. Like if you're picking up this work, don't sit just at home and read this. Like, bring a friend, you both get the book and then talk about it together. I think that's a great opportunity to kind of continue that dialogue in real life with the people around you. And, don't think, at least for me, I think the temptation is when people hear philosophy, they're like, oh, that's over my head. And it's really not. You mentioned that one of the reasons that you love Aquinas and think he's the greatest is because he's eminently practical. And the first question I get when I tell people about, I study philosophy, they go, well, what are you going to do with that? Isn't philosophy not practical? And I have my own answer to that question, but I'm curious, what's your answer to that question? When people say, oh, philosophy's not practical, or, what was your response to that? I'm sure you've gotten that before too.
That's a very good question. And my response to it is 2 words, which are dying, called liberal education. The basic principle behind the use of the word liberal here is that in the ancient world, there were slaves and there were free men. And slaves were the property of other people, and they were means to the end of making life easier for the slave owner. So Aristotle says, he first invented the term, there are 2 different reasons for seeking knowledge: as a means to some other end, as a practical device for getting something much more valuable, or as an end in itself. And he said the pursuit of truth for its own sake is higher and nobler and more important to us than the pursuit of truth for some other more practical end. So philosophy's great glory is that it isn't practical.
Yeah.
Why do you know the truth? Because truth is what God is. And truth is an end. Truth is an absolute, just as love is an absolute.
By gaining a greater understanding of God and of yourself through philosophy and through theology as well, you do have a greater sense of peace, but also you are on the path toward the truth and therefore to God. And so this is, certainly knowledge for knowledge's sake, but insofar as you're learning more about Christ and knowing more about God and reality itself, the philosophy does make you more real, as it kind of does lead you as well. And in that way, it brings you the happiness that you're searching for.
This is true even for an atheist who doesn't believe in God, because the atheist is honest and seeks the truth. And if he's honestly moral and seeks the good, he is seeking that which God is. God is perfect truth and goodness.
Yeah.
I suspect that at the last judgment, many atheists will be surprised by God's praise of them. Yes, you sought me, but you didn't know I had a name and a face.
Yes. Well, it reminds me of C.S. Lewis. I just read the Last Battle, where I can't remember the character, but he's a pagan, and yes, thank you. And he's there, and I remember reading that as a kid, being like, well, why is he there? And as I get older now, I see that because they're honestly searching for the truth, and that's why when I try to teach my students, or the people I'm most impressed with, are those who are honestly searching for the truth. Because that does all lead to only one end, which is the truth, which is God. But going back to Aquinas, you say that he's uniquely practical. And even title of your book, Practical Theology. How would we were talking about philosophy, being practical in a certain sense, but not in the sense of like it's utilitarian, but in the sense that it's beneficial to us, is an end in itself. But how is Aquinas uniquely practical among the philosophers?
For one thing, he's very concrete. He does not take refuge in abstractions. He uses abstractions always with concrete illustrations. And he will answer questions as concrete as, what happens to a priest who's celebrating Mass and a spider falls from the roof of the cathedral and swims around for a while in the consecrated wine and then drowns? What should he do? And Aquinas gave a very specific answer to that question, as if it were the most normal question in the world.
Wow, where does he? I'm not familiar with this passage. Where does he say that? Do you remember?
That's rather late in the Sola.
Okay, I have not read that passage. That's fascinating. It is eminently practical. I mean, you mentioned in your introduction how even on his deathbed, he's discussing very practical matters. Like when people think philosophers, again, they think these esoteric, beings. I mean, much like Kant. No offense to Kant, but they kind of are very odd people that kind of go around and think in their heads and question things that nobody questions. But Aquinas doesn't seem to be that way.
Supposedly, at his death, he was working on a commentary on the Song of Songs, the most mystical book in the Bible, and a short treatise on herrings.
I'm like fucking it, or
in the 4,000 pages of the Summa Theologica, there are many references to birds. And I forget the number. I think it's something like 100 different species of birds that Aquinas refers to. He was a bird watcher.
I think in some ways that he's taking after Aristotle. I mean, Aristotle was a botanist and a biologist, and worked with all that. So it's interesting. I did not know that about Aquinas. That's
very concrete.
Yeah, very concrete. And I think that goes along with Aquinas's clarity. You talk about the clarity of his writing, and this is,
if you're supremely abstract, you can be very clear. Mathematics is an example. And if you're extremely concrete, you can be clear. But if you're in the middle, if you're into sociological and political and psychological abstractions, you sound like a civil servant or a politician or a pseudo professor. So Aquinas didn't fool around with those middle things. He talked about birds and boots and boats, and he talked about God and eternity and truth. But he didn't fool around with the ideological stuff in the middle.
So has that inspired your own writing? Because I've read the books that we were talking about, but I've read a lot of your other works. One of my favorites was Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Heaven. I got it next to me here, and I remember just being wowed by that book. And you're such a clear writer. So is that kind of what's inspired your writing with the
Yes, but on a subconscious level rather than a conscious level. I didn't read Aquinas or C.S. Lewis or Pascal or Socrates, all of whose styles I admire, in order to consciously imitate him. But they get under your skin. They get inside of you.
Yeah.
This is why Tolkien's such a good writer. He's read all the myths. So he's inside those myth makers, and he's making myths that are like the old ancient powerful ones instead of modern imitations.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I had one of my professors, Monsignor Sokolowski, who I love very much. I worked with him at one point. He told me, write for golden retrievers. And too often I feel like academics have the problem of writing for another academic, and you don't do that. And I don't think Aquinas was doing that either. Like, yes, he has technical language, but that's more for historical reasons, not because he's trying to be overly technical.
Yeah, yeah. I tell my students, write for an intelligent 12-year-old rather than a confused 40-year-old.
Yeah.
And they find it difficult to do that, but Aquinas does that.
Oh, it's extremely hard. And it's not like some people say, well, you do that because people are stupid. It's like, no, quite the contrary. It's because you're a better thinker and a better writer if you can be very clear and precise in your language. And that's honestly, it's difficult. It's sometimes more difficult than having the thought in the first place, to be able to express it clearly.
And most philosophers are either clear or profound, but not both. Aquinas is both.
Yes.
What modern philosopher is both clearer and profounder than Aquinas? I don't know any candidate.
I don't know either. And especially, like you said, like there's many times where I read Thomas and I get more confused, and then I go back to the Summa and I'm like, oh, this makes way more sense. And I love that.
Clark at Fordham. He was like Thomas Aquinas himself on his feet. You would ask him a question and his eyes would light up. He says, that's a question I never quite thought of before. Let's see, what's the relationship between being and presence? People are present to each other. Are we present to our furniture? Is the furniture present to us? Is God present to himself? Let's look at that. And he spent 10 or 20 minutes in class together with the help of class. He'd ask us questions. He was a Socrates, exploring those questions. There was no such thing as a dumb question.
Those are the best professors, and those are the ones that I seek to imitate. And not only did I enjoy going to the class the most, but I ended up learning the most. Those that are inquiring together, which I really appreciate.
Because how to learn is not just their conclusions, but their method to see things as they see them, not necessarily to agree with them.
Yes.
To have that kind of clarity and profundity together as they do. For examples.
How do you, as a teacher, how do you teach that way? Because this is something I'm still trying to learn.
I don't start with a method. I'd say, all right, my end is to make philosophers resemble Thomas Aquinas. How do I do that? Well, here's means number 1. Here's means number 2. Here's means number 3. A kind of intellectual technology. I don't believe in intellectual technology. I think technology is for matter, not for minds. So I don't know. People ask me, what's your method of teaching? I said, I don't know. I say, Aquinas meet John Smith. Aquinas meet Jane Doe. And I try to get them to talk to each other.
So that's interesting, because when I have somewhat of a similar, I was about to say method, but it's not, like you said, it's not a method, it's a mentality, right? Like it's having that relationship with the students and then introducing them to great thinkers that are not you, right? Like you're just the conduit for these great thinkers. And a lot of times whether in a course or something, they say, well, here's some other methods, here's some things you can do. And it's very focused on method instead of that, building that relationship and just bringing the great thinkers and the great thoughts that they had to the students, and then making them engage with it. I think that's the other thing. It's just like you bring it to, and then you ask them to reflect on it and get their response to it.
That's why Socrates is such a great teacher. That's why I used him in that other book that I used the Socratic method by imagining the ideal university, Socrates at one end of the log and the student at the other end.
Yes.
And the university is simply the log that brings them together. By the way, Aquinas says that Socrates was the greatest philosopher who ever lived. When he asked the question, why did Jesus never write anything? And he says, well, there's 2 ways of teaching. The normal way is you have to write because your life is not sufficient. So you have to add to it. But his life was sufficient, so he didn't need to write anything. And Socrates also never wrote anything. He just lived his philosophy in speech.
Do you think the modern university system that and then has moved away from what it should be? Then,
Of course,
okay, I have a similar feeling, so I was curious if you did too.
it's become not just ideological, but uh, institutional and technological.
Yes.
Suppose Socrates were reincarnated today, and you met him on a university campus. You're Socrates, yes. Oh, well, welcome here. The academy is the invention of your great pupil, Plato, and you're the first great philosopher, and we do philosophy here. Oh, wonderful. You do philosophy here. How? Well, I'll take you to the philosophy. Excuse me, the what? The philosophy department. Philosophy, a department? How can philosophy be a department? You have a truth department, you have a love department, you have a beauty department. Well, you see, we gather together in these little rooms. We sit in chairs, and the professor gets paid for delivering lectures, and the students get paid. They pay their tuition, and then they take tests, and they're graded. What? That's what you call philosophy?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a different thing.
So what would you say? I mean, because Aquinas was a part of at least the medieval university system. Do you see any differences between the medieval institution versus the modern one then?
What Aquinas did in the university, namely deliver lectures which the students responded to, both in class and afterwards, almost always in a dialogue format, and that was it. It was a very small log. The student and the teacher were the two most important things. There was almost no administration. Today, 90% of the university is neither teacher nor student, but administration. Finances, committees, studies, all that stuff in the middle. And the stuff in the middle just gets bloated. And here's the head of the dog, which is now very small, and the tail of the dog, which is now very small, and the body is enormous.
Yeah.
In Aquinas' day, there was just the head and the tail and very little body in between.
I have one other question because I have some thoughts on this. I'm curious on yours. Do you think that also the scholars themselves have changed, since like the 1920s versus now, like and if they have changed, in what way? I'm curious.
Well, in a number of ways, there's still sort of absent-minded professors. That's traditional. And they talk about some of the same questions. They're still talking to each other. They're not totally uprooted from each other or from history. So no, not that much since the 1920s. In philosophy, I think for some reason or other, there are no great philosophers left. If you were to ask me, what living person are you confident will be regarded as a great philosopher 200 years from now? I would say not a single one. In the 1920s, there were dozens of them. Mm-hmm. But philosophy has gone through ages like that, where there were not too many great ones. And then suddenly, around the 13th century, you get them all at the University of Paris. And in the 19th century, you get them all at the University of Berlin. So that may happen again. Philosophy always buries its undertakers. It doesn't die.
Yeah. Why do you think that is, that there isn't? I mean, because even as you say that, I'm going through all the names in my head, of the great, and Father Norris Clark could be one of them, but why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a spiritual gravity. If the whole material universe is tied together by a force of gravity, why should the spiritual universe have less of a force? And I think great minds are providentially attracted to each other, like great bodies of matter. And that's true in religion as well as in philosophy. Here's Augustine and Ambrose. Here's Saint Francis and Saint
Dominic.
Yes. It just happens that way.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I mean, it certainly happens. I mean, and like you said, in the spiritual life with saints, it's kind of, you mentioned earlier about when you read the great thinkers, they wear off on you. And I think holiness is the same way, right? Like when you're around holy people, you become more holy. And not just because it's not just like, oh, it's a good example. there's something more to it than that. There's something like it's infectious, if that makes sense. Like it literally, like you said, it rubs off, whether spiritually or intellectually.
Well, think of this analogy. Think of a spiral galaxy. These enormous suns are spiraling around a center in an orderly way. Now, think of a large party where there's a very beautiful woman. It's sitting in the middle of a large room. She's not moving. And all the men around the room are like a spiral galaxy spiraling around her, trying to get closer and closer to her. I think if we could see human souls, we would see them in the same way that we see that galaxy or the people at that party. Here's a John of the Cross. Well, you got a couple of other saints are around him here. Here's an Aquinas. A lot of people around him.
Yeah.
Almost every school of Greek philosophy claimed that they were the true inheritors of Socrates, just as every denomination claims to be the true Christians.
Yeah.
It's gravity.
Yeah. Would you say this is one of the most important reasons everybody should read Aquinas? Because if he is the greatest philosopher and you want to wear off on him, this is why everybody should read him.
Yes. And this spiritual gravity doesn't work on a material level. It works on a spiritual level. That is, it's truth and goodness and beauty that are the forces that draw you to Aquinas. Why read Aquinas? Because he speaks the truth.
Yeah.
Because he understands what it is to be a saint. Because his work is beautiful. Mm-hmm. Not just beautiful in style, but beautiful in depth.
Yeah. There was one passage when I'm preparing for this, looking over some of these works again, that really hit me when you said, this was in Practical Theology, you said that there's a spiritual benefit for reading Aquinas, that you've gotten more out of Aquinas on a spiritual level and grown closer to God through the Summa than you have even through the spiritual writers. That was, to me, that's a very, not just a strong statement, but a profound statement. And because everybody is writing all these spiritual books, but yet returning to the Summa might be more of a benefit. Can you talk about that more?
It's the analogy that comes to mind first, strangely, is Christ's real presence in the Eucharist. Now, Protestants may love Christ deeply, and they may have all the equipment in their mind and in their will and in their feelings. But if their relation to the Eucharist is not one of real presence, it can't have that power and depth that a Catholic has. If you're a Catholic who believes that is Christ himself, literally, in front of him, he's not maybe as brilliant as the Protestant or as holy even. And yet he's got a power that's powerful simply because it's there. It's real. Ideas are important, but they can't do anything. They don't cause things. Minds cause ideas. Ideas don't cause minds. They influence minds, but they don't act. So when you read Aquinas, you read someone who's so in contact with reality, with being, with real things, that he shows you those real things, not just thoughts about them, not just theories of them.
Yeah. Well, it's the difference between the opinion and the truth. Like Aquinas brings you closer to the truth, not just his own perception of
exactly. It. It's objective, not just subjective.
Yeah.
Many of those words that have changed meaning into the English language have changed meaning into a kind of subjectivization. For instance, the word certitude. In Latin, certitudo means it's got a definite form. It's not unformed. Its potentials have been actualized. It's not just a potential organ, but a real organ. It's not just a potential book, but a real book. That meaning of certitudo is quite different than the modern subjective meaning of I am convinced by your argument. That is a mathematically convincing argument, not just a probability. All right, that's a legitimate meaning, but it's more subjective. Second example, happiness. Aristotle's and Aquinas' use of happiness, eudaimonia in Greek and beatitudo in Latin, means real objective happiness, not just the feeling of being happy. So it's compatible with suffering. Suffering is a part of happiness, but not in the modern sense.
Yeah.
So typically, words become more and more subjectivized. And that's one of the main obstacles to reading an ancient author like Aquinas. You have to get back into that objective mindset in some key terms.
I think of some of my lessons in phenomenology with Monsignor Sokolowski about, this idea that by understanding something, you're brought closer to the object, right? Like even the dichotomy between subjective and objective is really a Kantian creation, right? Like it's either the thing or you, but it really is about this relationship. And it's between, knowing something, just seeing you in the screen, right? Like I can see you, you're the object, but we have a relationship. Now it's virtual, obviously in this case, but it would be different if we were in person. But then when we have philosophy with Aquinas, it's developing that relationship with God, right? Like it's that
Yes.
relationship with you and God that he draws you more fully into.
Yes, yes. The epistemology of Aquinas is something difficult for the modern mind to understand exactly because of that realism. For Aquinas, as for Aristotle, truth is objective, but that doesn't simply mean that it's accurate. Here, I see a picture of you. You're not really present to me, but your picture is. And it's an accurate picture. It's not distorted. So that's what we call truth. All right. Something correct about that. But for Aquinas, as for Aristotle, when a certain form, let's say the form of a dog, is known by you, it's not that the concept of the dog in your mind corresponds to and matches and is a kind of picture of the form that's in the dog. It's the very same form.
Exactly.
You're not a dog materially.
Yes.
The form in your mind, if it's true, is the very same form that's in that dog. It unites them.
Yes. Yes. And that's why, again, going back to Aquinas too, is the what he's expressing, the truth that he's expressing is the same truth that is God, right? Like, and it's certainly, I'll have to qualify, it's pale compared to God. I mean, that's why he famously said it was all straw, but it still is the truth, right? Like it is, and it brings us closer to that. And that's why, when people talk about like, what should I be reading? I think Aquinas is it's certainly one of the top five, if not one of those after the scriptures. You mentioned in your book, and I think some people, I've engaged with some people who are unhappy about this, that at the Council of Trent, they put the Summa on the altar right after the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they talked about Aquinas as the teacher for the church. I'm curious on your thoughts on that, because you express it as a positive, but I've actually heard about that with colleagues who see that as a negative because they, are like, oh, they putting Aquinas too far ahead of Bonaventure and all these others. So I'm just curious on your reaction to that.
Those critics misunderstand what Aquinas is doing in his theology. He's not just constructing a brilliant system of ideas. He is being the instrument of Scripture. I understood Scripture better by reading Aquinas than by reading almost anybody else. It's not a rivalry. It's not a rivalry between the Bible, which is concrete, and the Summa, which is abstract, or the Bible, which is historical, and the Summa, which is unhistorical. Theology is not absent-minded. It's present-minded. It's about reality. Most of Aquinas' writings are theological, not philosophical. He saw philosophy simply as a servant to theology.
Handmaid.
And the more you go from philosophy to theology, the more concrete you become, not the more abstract.
Yeah.
So he's always pointing in that concrete direction to ultimately the Word of God, who is Christ himself. Yeah. And the supreme verbal example of that is the Word of God in Scripture. I mean, when Aquinas talks about the Word of God, the first thing he's thinking of is the Word of God on wood, not on paper. Christ himself, rather than the book. That's really good theology.
It's really good theology. And I think one thing that I loved in your introduction, and it's something I learned in graduate school and I wasn't familiar in undergrad, is the exodus reditus, or the, coming from God and returning to God in the Summa itself. And you have a diagram. I'm curious if you could talk about that, because that's not something like, because we always think of the Summa and these, each question in each article, right? And so it's very subdivided, which makes it very approachable for people. You don't have to read the whole thing like you did. I know people who've done that, but and it's a worthwhile project, but you don't have to do that. But But can you talk about that kind of overall structure of the Summa and how that really is revealing about Aquinas' own thoughts?
Yes, one of the things that makes the Summa interesting reading is that it's dramatic. It's the drama of being itself. Creation makes eternal being into also temporal being. And once being moves, it moves from God to creatures, through man, who is kind of the priest of creation, who offers it all up, and then back to God through moral and religious striving. So that God is the beginning and the end of a journey. I used to love reading maps when I was a kid. We didn't travel that much, but I wanted to travel. So I would, in my mind, say, oh, here I am in New Jersey. First, I'm going to go to California. Then I'm going to go up to Alaska, and then I'm going to explore the North Pole. And how do I get from there to Norway? Well, that's what you do when you're reading the Summa. You're not aware of it on the page, but that's the background. Where on the roadmap are you now? So it's a very dynamic book.
And that dynamism, as you say, is reflected in reality too, which is, I think, again, this kind of whole revealing of reality and God, this idea that we do, come from God and then we return to God through creation. And there's this dynamism to the Summa that's reflective of the dynamism in reality. So I thought that was really cool. And I love the diagram for it. And it's something I feel like a lot of people don't know as much about. Well, one other question I had for you was, you said that when St. Aquinas is the greatest, you said that he's particularly apt for our age, that his thinking is particularly his synthesis. So you talk about quite a few different syntheses that Aquinas does. But one I want to focus on is faith and reason. How does Aquinas synthesize faith and reason, and how is that helpful for our modern culture?
Well, it's helpful for modern culture because we are, each of us, one person. The word I is the most extreme example of a real unity. Our powers are many. Our dimensions are many. We have a soul and a body. The soul is not body, and body is not soul. Yet we're one person, not two. So that unity is precious. Now, faith and reason are our two main ways of knowing the truth. And obviously, to know the truth is essential to be a complete human person. So if those are the two fundamentally different ways of knowing the truth from our own experience and from divine revelation, to put those two together without confusing them, to marry them, is going to be fruitful. Here's a man, he's a complete individual, but when he marries a woman, he can have children. And the woman, though a complete individual, like a man, can't have children without a man. So faith and reason are like Adam and Eve. They're for each other. And when you have both, the faith improves the reason because it gives the reason much more than human reason alone can give. But reason also makes faith clearer and more understandable. Just as a man makes a woman more feminine and a woman makes a man more masculine. Those two things also are not only coming apart, but losing their separate identities in our culture, which is a very deep tragedy, very deep.
Yeah. I think it's interesting when you talk about faith and reason, because I think the temptation for many Catholics is to say, well, we have faith, so we can just use that path, right? And I'm not critiquing, going on the path of faith, but what is the benefit of having reason too? Or can you even separate the two?
Well, first, you can separate the two. You can distinguish them without separating them. You can marry them, or you can distinguish them and separate them. You can divorce them. But the advantage of having reason as well as faith is that it obeys what you're supposed to believe by faith. One of the things the Bible tells us is, be ready to give a reason for the faith that is in you. God himself says, come, let us reason together. Aquinas says, he who maligns human reason maligns God because God designed it.
That's a strong statement.
If you're wearing a beautiful sweater and somebody says, what a beautiful sweater it is, and you say, oh, no, it's just a humble sweater. Well, if your mother gave you that sweater, you're insulting your mother by saying it's only a humble sweater. No reason is the sweater. God's the mother. We should exalt it.
I love that analogy. That's beautiful. I Thank you. I will use that in my own teachings. That's a beautiful analogy because I think that it is a temptation to ignore reason, but I think it's particularly apt in our time in which faith is no longer the common ground. Aquinas talks about, you have to have common ground with somebody. And if the scriptures are not the common ground anymore, you don't have faith. You have to have recourse to reason as that common ground to lead people to that moment of faith.
I find very surprising and very instructively that when I talk to unbelievers about controversial topics, if the topics are religious, they are not threatened. For instance, suppose we talk about abortion. Well, this is what the church says, and this is why life is sacred. So, yeah, you believe that, and I don't. Let's just leave it at that. But when I appeal to the natural law, the natural reason, saying it doesn't depend on God, it just depends on reason. Thou shalt not murder. That is a human being. Abortion is murder. They feel deeply threatened. People are more threatened by reason than by faith. Yeah, because reason is universal, and they're all in it. They can't avoid it. They can't say, "Well, that's your truth and not my truth." Some people say that. That's nonsense. That's totally meaningless.
But it's pervasive, that belief, and it's one that we have to That's one of the first things I usually have to talk to somebody is do you believe that, right? Because if they do, there's
so I don't think sane people really believe that. I think they're just confused. I hope that's correct, because if they believe that, that's literally insanity. Yes. That really means, God, get off my seat.
Mm-hmm. No, you make yourself into God.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's ultimately the problem with a lot of the moderns, like you talked about Descartes, is maybe not even intentionally, but they take the place of God. They try to, Descartes seeking this absolute knowledge, right? And absolute certainty. And you can't get that unless you're God, right? All these moderns, the problem is they put themselves in God's seat, right? Where Aquinas is very docile to God and receptive.
Look at the difference between Descartes and a rabbi. Jews will not utter the name of God. It is too holy. Because to utter the name of God, which is I am, is to claim to be what God is, the I. Which is why when Jesus uttered that word, they took up stones to stone him. That's blasphemy. Now, Descartes says that's my supreme certainty. I am. This is self that I, this finite human being, have this absolute truth. Well, if he only added only because it's the image of the I am, he might have gotten away with it. But he's really getting into God's seat and saying, well, here's the starting point. I, not God, but I. And then later he'll prove the existence of God from those starting points. But he starts with himself and proves himself. And then he proves God. And then he proves the world. It's upside down.
Yeah.
Descartes' brilliant. And he meant.
Oh, he is.
But this is not how you do philosophy.
Oh, and it's ultimately tragic. The story of Descartes and many moderns is ultimately a tragic story because, some of them are well-intentioned, but they go about it in the wrong way. And because of that, they have tragic consequences, not only for themselves, but for culture. And we're seeing some of the ramifications of that culture, which is why I think it's so important to go back to Aquinas and go back to the scholastics because of that synthesis. Well, thank you for this. I have one last question before we wrap up, and that is for people who are maybe starting out with Aquinas for the first time, what tips would you give them? Obviously, your book has a lot of footnotes and a glossary that's helpful, but what other tips would you give somebody who's starting into Aquinas and how best to understand him and read his thoughts? Is there something they should be reading beforehand? Are there any ways to read Aquinas well?
Well, if my book is not available, just read some of Aquinas to get the flavor of him, and then go back to a good, decent introduction, like Ralph McInerney's, and then go back and read Aquinas himself. I tell my students, when I assign a great book, and then I'll assign other books later that will interpret it, I do it in that order deliberately, even though the great book might be more difficult for you than this modern explanation and interpretation of it. But you have to judge the interpretation by the classic, not vice versa. So read the classic first. You'll be a bit confused by it, but you'll be in it. You'll have the data anyway. Mm-hmm. And then go to a book that sorts it out and makes it a little clearer. And then in that light, read the book again. But don't start with the secondary sources. Start with the primary sources.
I agree. And then going back to it again, like I find if you don't understand it the first time, you set it down and come back to it and then read it again. And it'll happen.
Any book that's not worth reading at least twice is not worth reading once.
Amen to that.
That's a classic.
Amen to that.
Cow that gave you fresh milk every morning.
Yes, indeed. And Aquinas is one we can certainly go back to. So again, thank you very much for compiling these books and writing, these books and many others. I'm very grateful on a personal level too. Like I'm personally grateful for all that you've done. It's been very helpful for me and for many other people. So
well, thank you for your thank you.
Again, the three works that we've been discussing today with Dr. Kreeft are his Summa of the Summa, which is an anthology of the Summa Theologiae, focusing on Aquinas' works in philosophy. And if that's too long, you can also take a look at a shorter Summa, which is an even more condensed version of the Summa of the Summa. And in case you're more interested in some of Aquinas' theological works, you can check out Dr. Kreeft's Practical Theology, 350 Ways Your Mind Can Help You Become a Saint. If you're interested in going to Aquinas, this is one of the best way to start. And again, thank you so much, Doctor. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure being here. Bye-bye.